Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth webinar on policy and administration updates. I am Simbiat Yusuf, Member Relations Manager at Fourth. We have some announcement before I hand it over to our moderator today, Jeanette Shaw. Attendees, we ask that you please submit your questions through the attendee chat. We will get through them during the Q&A portion. We will also be sending out the webinar recording in a webinar recap after the webinar. A brief introduction to Fourth. Fourth is a nonprofit trade association advocating for smart transportation. Our work is focused on four main areas, which are industry development, demonstration projects, policy advocacy, and consumer engagement. Through all of that, we aim to advance the electric clean transportation industry. If you would like to have more information about Fourth, our membership, or other events, you can find that at our website at fourthmobility.org. There are 2 days left to register for the e-mobility equity conference, which starts on November 12th and 13th. If you haven't reserved your spot, you should reserve it now. You don't want to miss the show. Registration is free for NGOs, government, and academia, and $75 for corporations. If you want more information about that, we will include that in our webinar recap. We are in the month. The deadline for your CFP submission is coming up on November 20th, 2020. Registration and sponsorship opportunities are also available and open for the Roadmap Conference. More information will also be added to our webinar recap if you would like that information. And now I will pass it along to our moderator, Jeanette.
Great, thank you so much, Simbi. Very excited to be here today. And as Simbiat mentioned, one area Fourth works within is policy and engagement. First, I'd like to acknowledge the election of President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, as well as U.S. Senator Merkley and Congressman DeFazio, both who have won the re-election. So very excited from Oregon. Congrats. Oregon is also fortunate because of these incredibly intelligent and clean tech-minded transportation members of Congress. We are honored today to have members of their staff and companies that are engaged in transportation electrification on this webinar. I'm honored to be moderating today's panel and fortunate we'll be discussing how the result of last week's election is going to affect the transportation industry via charging infrastructure, federal incentives, and efficiency mandates. Given COVID-19, the recognition of systemic racism in the United States, and the underinvestment of infrastructure, there's an opportunity to reinvest in the United States via clean energy transportation. Given time, I'll just provide the names and titles of each speaker and where they work so we can move right into today's program. We'll first hear directly from Congressman Merkley. Our U.S. Senator has provided us with a pre-taped video, and then his staff, Logan and Jake, will be setting the stage for the importance of clean transportation via the Zero Emissions Vehicle Act. Following U.S. Senator Merkley's video and his staff, we'll then hear from Edward, who's the Director of Pacific Northwest Policy for the U.S. House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, which is chaired by Congressman DeFazio. Following Edward, we'll hear from Matt, who is the Director of Government Affairs at Electrify America, who will speak about the importance of charging infrastructure, and then Rustam, who's EMG System Infrastructure Lead at Daimler Trucks North America. He'll also be speaking about the importance of charging, in particular with regards to medium and heavy-duty electrification. Following these presentations, we'll have an opportunity to ask their panelists questions, both a couple that will come through, and then also please remember, and Simbiat reminds you to load your questions into the attendee chat, and we'll make sure they get asked. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Simbiat, who will go ahead and share U.S. Senator Congressman Merkley's video.
Greetings to all my fellow electric transportation enthusiasts. Senator Jeff Merkley here. And thank you, Jeff Allen and the good folks at Fourth, for not only hosting this Clean Transportation Forum, but for your tremendous leadership on advancing the cause of clean transportation and electric vehicles. As the owner and driver of a Chevy Volt and a Nissan Leaf, I'm a strong believer in the future of electric transportation. And for the sake of our planet, electric transportation is essential. From the historic wildfires that ravaged Oregon's forests and rural communities just a few weeks ago, which are continuing to blaze in California, to the destruction caused throughout the Gulf Coast by Hurricane Zeta, just one more powerful destructive storm in an already record-breaking hurricane season, we can see climate chaos wreaking havoc all around us right now. And electrifying our transportation sector, our cars, our trucks, and more is one of the biggest keys to stopping it and saving our planet. This particular sector of our economy has been America's largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. Since 2012, right up to the current recession, emissions from transportation have risen year after year, faster than any other sector of our energy economy. And over the past 5 years, air pollution from transportation emissions contributed to the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans. So the need to transition our nation's transportation sector for the sake of our planet and the health of our people couldn't be more clear. We can't solve climate chaos or stop the emission of greenhouse gases without electrifying our vehicles and embracing clean forms of transportation. That's going to require national investment in the infrastructure to support these vehicles, charging stations in particular. It's going to require an investment in R&D to figure out how to make batteries lighter and last longer, and that's essential for the electrification of long-haul trucking. It's going to take subsidies and tax breaks to accelerate the transition to electric vehicles. We've given and continue to give massive subsidies to fossil fuels. Electrified transportation at a minimum requires a level playing field. All across the world, we've seen that when governments support these industries and help their citizens make the transition, people embrace them. Unfortunately, that's not what we've seen from America's government over the last 4 years. Instead of embracing and supporting clean transportation, over and over again, we've watched President Trump and his congressional allies as they did everything they could to undercut progress. But now, under President Biden and a House that respects science and recognizes the importance of bold, aggressive action, we have a new opportunity to move forward quickly. We must seize this moment to drive this transition. As we head into 2021, Americans will have a much broader choice of electric vehicles, including some very impressive long-range models and some with incredible horsepower that blows your mind. That's why it's essential that we fully rejuvenate the $7,500 EV tax credit. For years now, up until the 2020 recession, we've seen the sales of EVs expanding, rising 38% in 2015, another 38% in 2016, 32% in 2017. America is ready to go electric, and I want to make sure we can. That's why just last month, I introduced the Zero Emissions Vehicle Act, which would set a federal zero emissions vehicle standard and end the sale of gas-powered vehicles by 2035. It's why I've helped communities like Portland, Salem, and Eugene qualify for federal grants so they could afford to replace their diesel-powered public buses with battery-powered electric ones. It's why in last year's spending bill, I fought to secure $40 million to deploy EVs through the Clean Cities program and to support cities in their efforts to install more charging stations. And it's why, as we look ahead to a new year and a new Congress, I'm going to continue working with all of you at Forth to build on these efforts. We have an opportunity now to really give a jolt of energy to the shift in our country towards electric vehicles. For the sake of our planet, we have to move forward boldly, together, into the electric transportation future. I look forward to working with all of you to make that happen.
I'd love to thank the Senator for his comments, and I love the comment also in the chat of why do I love Senator Merkley so much? And I think from Pacific Northwest, we can say the same. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jake and Logan.
Hi, folks. I'm going to let my colleague Logan start things off. I'm Jake Oken-berg.
Thanks, Jake. Logan Hollers here, handle along with Ag for Senator Merkley, the EPW committee, his work on that, Environment and Public Works in the Senate, which is basically environment, non-climate, and transportation infrastructure, which is obviously very relevant to what you folks are working on. So I know that Jake is going to dive into kind of the business, the economic part. I just wanted to give kind of a high level piece now that we're a few days out from the election. I mean, as folks on this webinar know, transportation sector is one of the fastest growing sources of U.S. climate pollution. Of course, that's a negative, but I think that both the incoming Biden administration and congressional Democrats see that as a huge opportunity. I think that Congress stands ready and willing, at least from the Dem side of the aisle, to work with the administration to address a lot of the pressing issues facing vehicle electrification and transportation in general. Talking fuel economy standards, ensuring that we transition to 100% of new vehicles being sold being electric. I mean, responses like these, especially in the transportation and manufacturing sectors, have the potential to create millions of new good-paying union jobs with prevailing wages, and really can help establish America as a leader in vehicle electrification and emissions reductions in the transportation sector. And I saw a question in the chat box earlier, how do we get Republicans to support massive solar in transportation? And I think that's it. We really frame it as an economic competitiveness issue. We don't want to outsource a lot of these new jobs that are going to be created. And as we see a transition away from traditional dirtier fossil fuels towards some of that electrification, both in transportation and other sectors, we want to make sure that America is the leader on that. And I think that the industry is really getting on board. I mean, GM just announced yesterday it's adding 3,000 more jobs focused on kind of the technical and software development side of EVs. And this is in addition to the company, offering at least 20 new EVs by 2023, investing 20 billion in EVs by 2025. Daimler's doing a lot of great work. And we're seeing the same at the state level. Governor Polis in Colorado signed the executive order moving the state to zero emissions vehicle standards. Senator Merkley, which you just mentioned, introduced the Zero Emissions Vehicles Act. And we had TIA passed out, the America's Transportation Infrastructure Act, the FAST Act reauthorization, passed out in a unanimous vote from the Senate EPW committee last year. That's $287 billion for surface transportation, and actually included a climate title for the first time ever in a surface transportation reauthorization. Section 1401 of that bill establishes a DOT, a grant program to strategically deploy some vehicle charging infrastructure, hydrogen fueling infrastructure for designated fuel corridors. Obviously, we're going to try and plus that up with the current makeup, and with kind of this year being an election year, we only had the 1 year extension. But I know Senator Merkley looks forward to working with his congressional colleagues on the Senate EPW committee and on the Senate as a whole, moving forward on that. Now, a lot obviously in Congress depends on the runoff elections for the U.S. Senate in Georgia. Those two seats will be pretty important, and I think most prognosticators would probably say it's more likely than not that Republicans maintain a slim majority in the Senate, which somewhat dampens hopes of progressive transportation, electrification legislation moving in the 117th. But the Biden administration has indicated that it's going to be willing to push a lot of priorities through executive orders, administrative action. I mean, his climate plan, both during the primary, during the general, and now that he has his Building Back Better transition website, includes specific sections on accelerating the deployment of electric vehicles. So right now, there's about 1 million electric vehicles in operation in the U.S. This number is going to be hard to scale up without the necessary infrastructure. And I think the president-elect Biden has made a very strong commitment to work with mayors, with governors, and with both sides of the aisle in Congress. Wants to deploy more than 500,000 new public charging stations, wants to explore transitioning the federal fleet to all electric. I mean, that's low-hanging fruit that shows that there is a federal commitment and a federal buy-in. And just really quickly, before we move over to Jake and kind of the business side, I mean, at the end of the day, this is going to require a huge federal commitment. And I was looking back over the FY20 PBUD under the Trump administration. For example, at the Department of Energy, there was an 81% cut to vehicle technologies. That's $321 million cut out of that budget. 72% cut to hydrogen and fuel cell technology. $135 million cut out of battery and electrification technology. 15 million cuts to electrification R&D for charging systems. Of course, Senate controls the purse strings. We're going to be the ones who eventually reject crazy PBUDs like that. But those kind of numbers are going to be vastly different under a Biden administration. And I think that at least working for an appropriator, we're really looking forward to seeing some better PBUD numbers that we can really work with across the aisle, both in the THUD subcommittee for appropes and in the full Senate as a whole. So I'll turn it over to Jake and let him talk about some of kind of the business pieces, some specific bills, what he sees in terms of West Coast collaboration and how the U.S. market from EVs can be expanded. And then I'll wrap up really briefly once he's done. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Logan. Great overview. And we'll, of course, take questions later if you miss anything that we mentioned or want to clarify. I just wanted to highlight a couple items, but before I move into those, I think just wanted to reiterate how important it is with an administration that wants to head in a different direction from what we've seen, and whether it's the weakening of auto emission standards, which is something that the current administration has done. I think we're going to see a general proposition from the Biden-Harris administration, where they are going to be pushing in every lever that they have to take on climate change, but also realizing this economic possibility. And I saw a question in the chat about foreign competition, China and BYD. And I think this is actually one of these areas where there can be a bipartisan, nonpartisan coalition where, as Logan mentioned, it's about the economy, it's about manufacturing, it's about U.S. Software ingenuity and innovation. And we combine all those things together. And I think, I'm always a glass half full person. I think we might be able to get some folks who are willing to, under this new administration, join Senator Merkley, join Congressman DeFazio in at least doing some incremental changes, if not something more bolder. And there are levers at the presidential administration level, like the emission standards, that really can make a difference. Very quickly, I wanted to mention, because I've seen in the chat and some of the remarks, other types of vehicles. The senator is very well aware that this goes far beyond our personal vehicles, and there are so many ways that we can impact this. A few different programs that I know many of you are aware of, but that are very important to Senator Merkley as an appropriator on the Appropriations Committee. One is the Federal Transit Administration's Low and No Emissions Program for transit buses. The senator has pushed every year to increase the no emission portion of that. And we've seen that bearing fruit in Oregon already, where we have Lane County, Eugene, Salem, Rogue Valley, and Medford, and TriMet in the Portland metropolitan area, able to use some of those federal funds to augment what they were already doing in terms of transitioning to low and no emissions transit vehicles. The Community Health and Clean Transit Act is something that Senator Merkley has introduced in this current Congress, and it would provide for interest-free loans to pay for that delta between a conventional diesel bus and an electric bus, a no emissions bus, which of course that delta exists, as you all know, and the government could be offering a way to make that purchase that much easier, with being paid back with 0% interest over the lifetime of the bus. And we know that the operating costs are less, the maintenance costs are less. And so we think this is a cool way to go about getting more transit agencies to switch out the vehicles that they have. I'll note that one of our co-sponsors on that is Senator Kamala Harris. So we hope she'll bring in some enthusiasm for this program into the new administration and maybe give us a lift up in the Senate for pushing that forward. Finally, I just wanted to mention the Super Truck program, which I know you'll hear about in a little bit. We have Daimler Trucks North America here in Oregon doing some great work. They've been a strong partner in that program for years. Senator Merkley continues to support that program through appropriations. I think we received about $20 million that we pushed for in the last budget, and we're going to keep pushing for that as well. I'll leave it there and hand it off to our colleague in the House.
I just wanted to say, Jake, really quickly, I think that's a great point that I might have glossed over. Senator Merkley obviously very much cares. He's personally invested in moving towards electrification of passenger vehicles. But I think that the real gains that we've seen, kind of the incentives, the return on investment, has been in the public transit realm. A lot of buses in Oregon especially are moving that way, even if it's natural gas rather than fully electric. Like, those are concrete wins that we can tout and that we should continue to expand in the 117th. I mean, there's EV charging corridors going up along the West Coast. We're seeing that expand to some states on the East Coast as well. But really, at the end of the day, the U.S. market for EVs, for passenger vehicles, is still largely limited to consumers in urban areas who can afford some of the private charging stations and areas where state and local governments have invested in that EV charging infrastructure. So any real expansion of EV usage, both from the public transit side and from the passenger vehicle side across the nation, and we're talking in rural markets, households, workplaces, everywhere, is going to require a significant federal infrastructure investment. And I think that I saw in the chat box a question about HR2, the Moving Forward Act, and I think that that bill is an excellent example of the type of federal investment that we need for a revolutionary infrastructure bill. And I'm sure that Edward from Chairman DeFazio's team would be happy to discuss a bill that Senator Merkley is very much in support of. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Logan and Jake. And now we'll pass it over to Edward.
Great. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Looking in the attendee list earlier, it was nice to see some familiar names and faces both in Oregon and across the country. My name is Edward McGlone. I'm the Director of Pacific Northwest Policy for Chairman DeFazio, who represents Eugene and Southwestern Oregon, but in his leadership role as the Chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, carries on a large responsibility for transportation policy across the nation. As I think all of you are very familiar, earlier this year, Chairman DeFazio introduced what became H.R. 2, the Moving Forward Act, which was the House Democrats' $1.5 trillion infrastructure investment. The backbone of that piece of legislation was our surface transportation reauthorization, which included just about $1 billion in investment in surface transportation. Chairman DeFazio, from the outset of developing this legislation, was crystal clear that any major change in transportation policy absolutely must address climate change. The transportation sector is the single largest contributing sector to greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, beating out energy, manufacturing, and other aspects of the economic system across the country. That's largely because we have a very carbon-intensive fleet, both in terms of passenger vehicles as well as rail, public transportation, and heavy freight, both in terms of ocean bound and on trucks. And so Mr. DeFazio set forth really a visionary piece of legislation that was focused on making sure that we meaningfully address our carbon footprint and reducing carbon pollution in the United States' transportation system. It has record investments in public transportation, actually requires that states have greenhouse gas reduction goals that are progressive, not regressive. And it also includes substantial investment in bike and pedestrian safety so that we can make it possible for people to walk, bike, and take transit through their communities. On the specific issue that we're discussing today, the legislation also includes remarkable levels of investment in electric vehicles and fleet transition, both for passenger vehicles as well as for public transportation. One of the major investments was $1.4 billion into a clean energy charging system to build out nationwide. The intent of that is to help allow the existing networks that we have and the identified EV charging networks that were part of prior legislation Chairman DeFazio helped to develop, and actually build that out to reduce the range anxiety, which is one of the largest inhibitors in the personal passenger vehicle side of things, in addition to the cost barrier that we see and the need to make investments in things like tax credits or even potentially cash on the hood, which, while outside of our committee's jurisdictions, are an important part of the general equation for making the transition to passenger vehicles. In addition to the private passenger vehicle side of the equation, though, we also invested $1.725 billion into the low and no emissions bus program, which you heard about from my Senate colleagues. That program is specifically targeted at public transit agencies and hastening the fleet transition from high emitting diesel buses into clean or low emission vehicles that will help to reduce pollution and particularly make a benefit in some of our most congested cities and some of the areas of environmental justice and racial equity that we're very, very concerned about. Over the 4 years of the Trump administration, we've been quite concerned because the way that they have administered this program has been essentially just kind of sprinkling a little bit of money across communities throughout the country, a bus here, a bus there, where communities don't have true plans for fleet transition, nor is the investment that the federal government providing sufficient to make a meaningful investment into changing things towards the future. And so in our legislation, we actually required that DOT make meaningful investments in each of these grants, large enough so that it could be at a scale to make a carbon impact and allow for the infrastructure investment, not just in the vehicles and the rolling stock, but in the transmission and charging, as well as the staff investment for training both operators and maintenance folks to actually justify making that long-term transition. We were very excited to see that Lane Transit District in the chairman's home district has made a commitment to transition away from diesel buses to clean fuel and electric vehicles over the next 10 or 15 years. And we're happy to be able to provide substantial resources to support that. So looking forward, we're really excited that President-elect Biden campaigned on a very strong and aggressive message of tackling climate change. The president-elect made it crystal clear in his messaging from day one that we as a country need to return to listening to scientists. And first and foremost within that, at least in the transportation field, is addressing climate change. Chairman DeFazio stands ready to work with President-elect Biden to implement that aggressive vision and follow through on the very clear mandate for governing that sent President-elect Biden to the White House. We anticipate next year moving fairly quickly on an infrastructure bill that will include many of the priorities discussed previously in moving forward. We spent a lot of time to develop that legislation. We passed it across the House with a bipartisan vote, Republicans and Democrats, and we are ready to get to work again, rolling up our sleeves and doing the hard work that the American people expect their Congress to do for them, to invest in electric vehicles, to invest in reduction of carbon pollution. I should also note in the Moving Forward Act, outside of our committee's jurisdiction, but other investments, there was expansion of tax credits for electric vehicles, as well as, and this is, I think, fairly important on the government procurement side of things, an investment to electrify the fleet of the United States Postal Service, which has very old vehicles. They run on unclean fuels. They are due for a recapitalization of their fleet and the replacement of their fleet. And this is a really meaningful way that the federal government can both lead the charge as well as substantially reduce its carbon footprint and reduce carbon pollution in our communities. So with that, I'll go ahead and wrap it up, save a little bit of time for question and answer later in the program. And thank you for the opportunity to present.
Great. Thank you so much, Edward. And we'll go ahead now and transition to Matt with Electrify America.
Hello, my name is Matt Nelson. I'm the Director of Government Affairs at Electrify America. For those of you who don't know what Electrify America is, we operate the largest open network of DC fast chargers in the United States. We actually only opened our first station in 2018, but we've been opening stations at about 4 per week ever since. And this morning, we announced the opening of our 500th station in the United States. This includes 16 stations with 63 ultra-fast chargers in Oregon, and 5 more are under construction in the state. So we're kind of the little engine that could. We went from non-existent to the largest network, and we also feature ultra-fast charging technology. Just a second on that. Before a couple of years ago, 50 kilowatt chargers were what folks usually referred to as DC fast chargers. We deploy 350 kilowatt chargers, which power equals speed. So the station can refuel a vehicle at 7 times the speed of the previous state of the art, adding about 20 miles of range per minute. So that's just who Electrify America is and what we're up to. But I wanted to spend a few minutes here today talking about policy for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to assume the election stays as is, and that Georgia does not go well for Democrats. And as a result, I'm going to assume that we're operating in a circumstance of divided government. To me, there is a ton that can be done in the EV space under divided government. There are all sorts of different policy opportunities and regulatory opportunities. I'm going to focus on 3 regulatory opportunities and 3 legislative opportunities that I think can really get done. The first is national greenhouse gas and CAFE standards. As many of you probably remember, we had one national program with the states led by California and DOT and EPA all joining into one framework. I think that can be reestablished. I think that the California framework negotiated what's known as the California Framework Agreement, negotiated between 4 major OEMs and the California Air Resources Board, can become the baseline for a new national framework of regulation, increasing fuel economy, and most importantly, from the EV space, continuing the bonus credits for electric vehicles. This makes it very attractive and appealing for automakers to deploy EVs. The second really important regulatory space is the waivers for California and other states to set, most importantly, the ZEV mandates. We've had 2 states in the last couple of years adopt either legislatively or administratively have become ZEV states. That's Colorado and Washington. Many others are looking at it, and there's been some question about whether the states will be able to continue to do that. I think a Biden administration can set the record straight on that one and make sure states get the waivers they need to enforce ZEV mandates. And I think that the position of the Biden administration on California's 2035 100% ZEV mandate is an open question, but certainly an area where the law is on California's side. And the third category is one, the first two you've probably all heard about. The third I want to emphasize is the renewable fuel standard. And this is an area where Senator Merkley has been a real leader. Most of you probably think of the renewable fuel standard as something to encourage biofuels, but in fact, it allows for renewable fuel that's delivered to electric vehicles to receive credits under a 2014 regulation. And unfortunately, EPA has been sitting on applications to do this ever since 2015. Oak Ridge National Lab assessed the impact of what this policy could do and concluded that it would add 1.4 million plug-in hybrids and 3.5 million additional battery electric vehicles to our roads by 2025 against a business as usual policy. So let me state that again. 3.5 million additional BEV cars in the United States as a result of one policy that requires no change of law and no change of regulation. Senator Merkley, as I mentioned, has been the leader in this space, and he has carried language in the EPA's appropriations bills to direct that they take action here, and this year even included funding for this activity. But this is an area where pressure and encouragement on the administration may be necessary. I mentioned 3 regulations, 3 statutes. So I think that there can be progress in 3 critical areas. The first is in the legislative space. The first is the EV tax credit. Senator Stabenow and many others have put together a massive coalition to extend the $7,500 credit to allow automakers to continue to benefit, or consumers to continue to benefit from that. And I think that the barrier to that has been the White House. So there's optimism that could pass in a new administration. There is a tax credit for charging stations that keeps expiring and has some odd features to it that limit its effectiveness. And Senator Carper and Alexander have introduced the Securing America's Clean Fuel Infrastructure Act, which would reform that tax credit for charging stations. We think that can happen this year. And it's critical to encouraging the kind of investment in ultra-fast charging that we think is necessary to drive EV adoption. And finally, Chairman DeFazio deserves tremendous credit for his work on creating the $1.4 billion grant program that was just mentioned before in HR 2. There is a companion version of that has already passed the relevant committee in the Senate. So there is hope that kind of program could be established. We think that though it's divided government and these aren't revolutionary provisions, that this is enough. These 6 things that I just described are enough to create the right environment and incentives to drive EV adoption in the US and hit our national goals, at least in the short term. And so we think that's where the focus should be, and happy to take any questions. Hopefully I was within time limits. A lot to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. And you were right on time. Appreciate the 3 regulatory opportunities and 3 legislative opportunities. And with that, we'll go ahead and turn it over to Rustam with Daimler.
Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Rustam Kocher with Daimler Trucks North America. I hope you can hear me all right, and I'm happy to be here. So real quick conversation to touch on a couple of the other points that were made by the previous speakers. I'm not ready to give up on the Senate. I hope everyone is excited and eager to jump in and participate in that process as I am. So hopefully we can make that happen and not have to deal with the split Senate. Congratulations to Electrify America on opening their 500th station. In that vein, I'm very proud to announce that Daimler Trucks has also hit a similar 5 milestone. We are proud to announce that we've hit our 500,000th mile in our 2 innovation fleets down in Southern California, with our innovation fleet running with Penske and NFI, as well as our customer experience fleet running with many different customers. We've now hit 500,000 miles with our trucks, and these are Class 6, Class 7, and Class 8 trucks doing real miles, hauling real freight for real customers, doing real work. And it's a tremendous achievement, and we're proud to have done it, and we will continue to get more trucks on the road. So, as many of you may know, in fact, I'm going to share a quick link on that story to all of you. Real quick. So, as many as you may know, transportation emissions are a significant portion of greenhouse gas emissions. The transportation sector is about 28% of all greenhouse gas emissions, and medium and heavy duty is 23% of that segment. What's interesting on that segment, though, is that the decision makers of that 23% of transportation emissions are very, very small compared to light duty trucks or light duty vehicles. And the reason is because most of those are fleet buyers. And so we have an opportunity in medium heavy duty to really make a significant impact by transitioning to zero emission trucks. There is a decision made at the fleet level when they want to purchase a truck that is very spreadsheet based, very what we call TCO, or total cost of ownership based. And it's very different than someone going out and buying a fancy red sports car because they turned 40. That's a feeling decision. That's a decision someone makes with passion. Commercial vehicles are purchased with a spreadsheet, and they go through a very total cost of ownership decision-making process. And to that vein, that decision can be heavily impacted by government influence, by having a program to cover that cost between the purchase price of the vehicle and the current cost of a battery electric. As we all know, battery electrics do cost a little bit more than a traditional internal combustion engine. And so having a program similar to the municipal bus no-low program, where the difference between the cost of the vehicle and a traditional cost of the vehicle is covered by a government subsidy program, can make a significant difference in fleets adopting these vehicles and bringing them in. So we would ask for a ZEV voucher program to cover a price gap between diesel and ZEV medium and heavy duties, say around $2 billion, a total of 5 years for the Senate and House staff that's listening, putting some numbers on the table. And we do want to thank you for your continued support for the Super Truck program. It's been a model for heavy duty research and development support, and we're proud to have Super Trucks programs, trucks on the road, and Super Truck program ongoing at the moment as well. So I'm happy to have that support. So in May of 2019, Daimler AG, which is the global company, offered to the world our Ambition 2039, which is our path to sustainable mobility. And we have pledged that we will have carbon neutral new passenger car fleets and aim to have plug-in hybrids and all electric vehicles to make up more than 50% of car sales by 2030, which means by 2039, we have a concrete milestone of a holistic, sustainable corporate strategy for Mercedes-Benz cars. So I'm going to share this link as well. And that does extend to Mercedes-Benz trucks. It is an ambition of ours to transition as quickly as we can to low and zero emission vehicles, and we're attempting to do that. And as I mentioned, we have our fleets operating down in California, primarily due to incentive funds that are available through the state of California to incentivize the purchase cost of those trucks. And we would ask that we have the opportunity to do that in more places than just California. Some other things that could be done to help out. Many of you may know that Thomas Built Bus is also part of the Daimler Trucks North America family. And there is substantial interest in electrifying school buses. It has tremendous benefits for the community, for the students, as well as potentially utility. And so having a clean school bus act that I think was sponsored by Senator Harris at the time, where there's grants to purchase EV school buses, $1 billion over 5 years, would be substantially helpful. And if funding on that could be increased as well, I think there could be a lot of movement in that sector. We are also looking at maybe a 12% federal excise tax repeal for zero emission trucks. That would mean about $20 billion over 10 years. It would be really, really helpful to reducing the cost of those electric trucks and getting those zero emission trucks on the road. And all of that would not be possible without having charging infrastructure. It's a linchpin. It's tremendously important that infrastructure be in place to support these vehicles. I'm working on a new charging standard. I actually lead a global consortium of companies that are working on developing what we call the megawatt charging system and getting MCS as well as CCS infrastructure in place in the public realm to charge these trucks as they go about doing their normal business. Hauling freight would be tremendously important and a linchpin to getting these vehicles on the road, not only from Daimler Trucks, but from all other electric vehicle manufacturers. So I'm going to cut my talk a little bit short. I think the question and answer period is probably a little even more valuable. So I'm going to throw my time to the end where we can have a robust conversation. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Rustam. And if I could ask all the speakers to go ahead and turn your videos on for the Q&A, that would be terrific. And thank you each for some fantastic comments. And it has certainly energized our attendees to ask a whole host of questions. And why don't we go ahead and get started. There was a couple, one in particular, someone asked if the slides are going to be available. There haven't been slides, but the webinar is videotaped. So we certainly will be sending that link out to attendees. And those of us who are panelists and the moderator have the ability to go back and answer questions. So we'll be doing that as well. But in the meantime, when we get our first question, and there seems to be 4 or 5 categories that questions were asked around. One is the Republicans, and one in particular, how will Republicans support massive solar and transportation? But in addition, how will the Republicans, if Georgia does not end up being a win, how do we think the Senate's going to respond with the Republican majority? And are there going to be opportunities to negotiate something? And that is from one of our board members, Tim Miller. I'm going to open that up to perhaps Logan, Jake, Edward, Matt.
Sure, I'll start on that. And I would love to hear Edward's thoughts as well, coming from the House where the Dems have the majority. I mean, for our purposes, I think that, of course, we would see a lot more movement on a lot of these progressive transportation policies were Democrats to be in control of the Senate. That said, I'll reiterate that we had a $287 billion surface transportation bill unanimously passed out of the Senate EPW committee last year before last. Of course, that's just one part of the FAST Act. You still have, the banking committee, which has jurisdiction over the busing, which includes electric buses. You have commerce, which has jurisdiction over rail, which we're increasingly seeing being electrified. You have Senate Finance, who has to figure out how to pay for that, whether we're looking at indexing the gas tax, moving to a VMT model. Point is, Republicans have proven willing to at least come to the table to discuss some of these priorities around electrification. I don't think that we're going to see a full-scale shift towards full electrification, but there are incremental gains that can be made. And I think that with Chairman DeFazio especially, but with House Democratic leadership really pushing and leading the vanguard on that, I think you will see some of those more moderate Republicans kind of read the tea leaves and say, okay, we're moving away from some of the traditional internal combustion engines, the fossil fuels. How can we be the most competitive on an international stage, and how can we ensure good paying union jobs in these emerging categories? But again, I would love to hear kind of Edward's thoughts on moving the other chamber.
I think that was really good feedback. I'm of a couple of minds. I think first and foremost, the survey data is crystal clear that Republican voters believe that climate change is a real and meaningful threat to America, to our national safety, to our economy, and to our way of life. And so Republican senators representing red states need to get serious about taking climate change and the threat of the climate crisis seriously. If they're not willing to do that in a transportation bill, then they're not willing to do that at all. And so ultimately, that's going to be the conversation that needs to happen. Having President-elect Biden in office is going to change the way that negotiations work on Capitol Hill. When we sent our bill, which passed with a bipartisan vote, both the committee and the House of Representatives to the Senate, Leader McConnell declared it dead on arrival. And so that doesn't provide me with a ton of optimism, especially when Republicans in our committee did introduce more than 30 amendments to weaken or eliminate climate change provisions and introduce zero amendments to strengthen or address climate change. So there is a situation here where the Republican Party and their elected officials are not in alignment with their voters and their expectations. And I think that this election, where President-elect Biden campaigned on climate change and received a clear mandate to govern on climate change, should help to change that. The House is ready to take it up. We're going to continue to put pressure on our colleagues in the Senate. And I think that should create space for some negotiation. I think, unfortunately, we'll not likely get everything that we're aiming for if Republicans continue to hold the Senate, but that is the nature of negotiation. And that is in some way, I suppose, what the American public will expect us to do if they return a divided government into the 117th Congress.
Perfect. We also have a number of questions around e-bikes and scooters, trikes, three-wheel vehicles, and as most know, we are fortunate here in Oregon and in Eugene to have Arcimoto that is producing electric fun vehicle, FUV, and the questions are related to should there be more incentives for those vehicles? Are there incentives for e-bikes, the trikes, the FUVs of Arcimoto? And if so, can we expect this to come sometime soon? I would open that up to our congressional staff.
I guess I can take that one first, although I'm not sure if I have a lot of clarity that I can provide at the moment. We are lucky in the chairman's district to have Arcimoto manufacturing small-scale electric vehicles, and they're growing and had a successful IPO several years ago. Lane Transit District is testing out a mobility on demand pilot with an electric vehicle shuttle in downtown Eugene that prior to COVID at least was seeing some pretty good results. And so what we're trying to do on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee side, at least, is to open the door for greater innovation and create more encouragement for small scale deployment of electric vehicles. As well, we've talked with freight companies who have looked at transitioning away from using heavy delivery vehicles and actually using electric powered trikes to do small scale deliveries. I think UPS was piloting that in Seattle. There's a manufacturer of those trikes up in Portland that is doing some pretty innovative stuff. We're working with them to see where we need to clarify things in federal code such that those vehicles are not treated as automobiles, but instead as bicycles. So there are some technical pieces there. I think there was a lot of really cool creativity coming out of Europe during the pandemic, where you saw in France and other countries actually creating direct incentives to purchase bikes and e-bikes. Another European country, I'm blanking on it right now, is doing a cash for clunkers where you can trade in your old carbon polluting car and get a substantial investment towards an e-bike. And so those are the types of creative solutions we need. Not all of them are within our committee's jurisdiction, but I think that it is in many ways an all of the above equation.
Great. Thank you so much, Edward. Another question with regards to charging. Are there plans to standardize the cost of charging? And of course, we hear this question quite a bit. As one person says, prices are all over the place. The time-based charging is silly and expensive as gasoline. What are the opportunities to standardize the cost?
I would love to speak on that if I could.
Yep.
So with our innovation fleet down in Los Angeles, we've got 5 different locations with one of our major partners in that program. It covers 3 different utilities, and all 3 have different pricing in regards to how those vehicles absorb kilowatts. And not only that, it's all time of use based charging. So when they plug in and when they charge could be, that charge could be different over the course of a day. And then you have demand charges on top of that. So we've got 2 big IOUs and a municipal involved in that one, and they all 3 have different programs. From a Daimler Truck perspective, we would ask that there is some movement towards standardization or a commonality of costs, but even more than that, we would ask that utilities put a program together that is crafted to support charging of commercial vehicles. It's a different beast than private EVs. There's really high peaks potentially, like I talked about megawatt charging. but there's tremendous opportunity there. And so, SCE, PG&E, SDG&E have all put together programs for commercial truck charging, for commercial fleet charging, and we would encourage other utilities to look at a similar program.
I'll just jump in quickly on this. Electrify America just transitioned 25 states to kilowatt hour pricing, and we have one price in all 25 states. So you drive up to a station in Florida or Virginia or Maine or Oregon or Washington or California, you pay exactly the same price, which is way more consistent pricing than you see in other fueling segments, where the price can be different a quarter mile down the street. And we price now by the kilowatt hour. No fees, no session fee. It's straight kilowatt hour pricing, regardless of power level, regardless of speed. You get the same product in the same volume, pays the same price. The only thing that stops us from doing that nationwide are that some states still consider a charging company to be a utility. So if we sell power by the kilowatt hour, then suddenly we are a utility in many of those states. It's illegal to be a utility because we aren't the utility. They're still vertically integrated, and so. But we do it in as many places as we can. In the heavy duty space, we recently announced our commercial division. So what was just mentioned about the difficulty and inconsistency of charging in the heavy duty and medium duty space, something we hear all the time. Our commercial division stands ready to take that off of your plate. So all you have to do is pay a fixed kilowatt hour price to us, and we'll manage your demand charges. We'll manage the entire operation. We think that will reduce a barrier. Transit agencies, in many cases, had gotten out of fueling their own vehicles, even when they were liquid and natural gas powered vehicles. Well, electricity is way more complex. And if we're asking transit agencies to get into the fueling business only for electricity, that creates this artificial barrier that any fleet operator is going to say, let's stick with diesel or let's stick with natural gas. I know exactly how to manage that. So we think that we can solve a number of different problems by working with the fleet operators to take this off their plate.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matt and Rustam. And so there have been several questions about USPS and can we electrify that fleet? Any kind of words of wisdom there, or will it potentially happen? And then one other additional question I'm going to ask you all is, what is the one thing you look forward to in 2021? So perhaps you can think about that in the interim.
At least, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
In a former life, I did actually work on this USPS issue. The only thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over to others, is when I looked into this, the vehicles in the USPS fleet travel a shockingly small number of miles per year. And that's one of the big barriers. That's why by the way, they never get replaced, because if they travel like 5,000 miles, the average vehicle does about 5,000 miles a year, if I remember correctly. So they can drive them for 20 or 30 years before they get into high mileage situations. And that's why that's one of the barriers that has impeded turnover. But let me turn that over to people that know more than me.
I certainly do not know more than you, but in terms of transitioning a public fleet, I mean, GSA has already told us the federal government right now owns or leases right around 650,000 vehicles, a little more probably now. About 170,000 of those are military vehicles. So what we need to do is transition all the subcompact, compact, and mid-sized vehicles in the federal fleet to electric versions. And if I had a magic wand, I would say, GSA, we need to clarify the procurement rules for all federal agencies to make clear that the purchase or lease of domestically manufactured EVs is required whenever available. And in the FAST Act that EPW passed, we did have a Section 1510 that created a federal interagency working group for the conversion of federal fleet to hybrid electric vehicles, alternative fuel vehicles. CEQ runs that. We'll see if that remains in the final, but I think that, again, that's some low-hanging fruit where the federal government can make concrete investments that will show a return on investment as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Logan. And so we have another question that's based on the economy, and it's people are concerned about losing their jobs. If there's a move towards vehicle electrification, incumbent industries could potentially be the most impacted with manufacturing of various parts for internal combustion engines, the oil industry, ICE vehicles, and so forth. What can be realistically done to help those workers transition effectively to electrified transportation or other work? And is there a message to the country to help minimize the deep divide currently?
Yeah, if I could jump in on that, I think that's a good segue into a proposal that Senate Democratic Leader Schumer and Senator Merkley have put forward called Clean Cars for America. There are three main components to it, but one of the three is a multi-billion-dollar fund that would do two things. One, it would provide cash grants to manufacturers to build new factories for assembling electric vehicles, manufacturing charging equipment, manufacturing and recycling critical component parts of EVs like batteries. And then the second component would give grants to manufacturers that retool existing US factories that are currently making internal combustion engine vehicles or component parts. And so I think something along those lines with some significant multi-billion-dollar investments would be very critical. I did also want to acknowledge a few comments that we've received about equity issues and folks that cannot afford vehicles. One part of that strategy could be giving additional dollars to folks that are lower income. And I mentioned there are three components to this Clean Cars proposal. The first would reinstate credits for folks, rebates to purchase electric vehicles, with additional several $1,000s available for folks that are at 200% or lower than the poverty level, as well as a 20% rebate if you buy a used EV that was manufactured before this program went into place. So we could talk about how much to invest in that, whether to raise the percentage, whether to do more. But I did want to mention that beyond just the general benefits that society gets, and especially low-income communities with lower emissions, we do need to do some targeted proposals to allow everyone to share in this revolution sooner rather than later.
And I know that doesn't really fall into the Daimler truck piece, but as an addition to that, there needs to be a program to get charging in multifamily dwellings as well, to support those vehicles that are going to lower income families.
So thank you. That is the third and final component of the Clean Cars for America proposal. I just didn't want to talk too much, but it is making charging infrastructure accessible. Senator Merkley, Senator Schumer proposed $45 billion in grants to states and local municipalities exactly for that. Charging infrastructure not only along city streets and public parking areas, and especially with a focus on low-income areas, but also grants to entities that install infrastructure in homes, apartment buildings, private garages, or other private residential or commercial properties, and again, with a focus on low-income communities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rustam. And Jake, I was going to mention the same. So look at this collaboration of this call and the folks on this call and the panelists. So thank you so much. We have ended the time we can take for questions, but if we could have just each speaker say just one thing they're looking forward to in 2021, and perhaps I'll start is the fact that Fourth is now embarking on and engaging in investing in national policy. I look forward to seeing you each in DC, if not again via Zoom, but I think most of you I saw last March, so it's been quite a bit of time since we've seen each other in person. With that one, I hand it over to Logan.
Moving forward, I think I'm really looking forward to two main pieces. One, the groundswell and the support across the political spectrum of constituents of members in Congress that are really pushing their members towards addressing some of these big picture concerns. I know that it all ties back to climate, and I know that's often a dirty word for the GOP and for Republican senators and House members, but I think that folks on the ground are seeing those impacts and have really kind of changed their way of thinking and want Congress to address a lot of these issues through some more progressive policies. My second piece would be, and sorry for the pressure, Edward, but continuing to see that great leadership by Chairman DeFazio and the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee really putting forward, visionary, big picture legislation that sets the stage for American competitiveness and American climate addressing forward.
So Edward, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I think what I'm looking for is having an administration we can actually partner with to get things done in the climate space instead of fighting over whether or not the sky is blue or the sun shines hot. We're actually going to work together on an agreed upon set of basic facts and take the guidance of the scientific community to meaningfully address climate change.
Thank you. Jake?
I, as the senator's business advisor, look at this from an economic standpoint. And the way that I see this is that this transition to no emission vehicles is occurring already. And for the Republican Party, the question is, what do you want to do in terms of making sure that some of the jobs, if not most of them, will arrive in your community as this transition occurs? Do you want to just let everything happen in Asia or in Europe? Or do you want to be part of the solution in making sure that folks in your communities not only have access to these vehicles, but actually have a hand in producing them? And so I think from a jobs and economic standpoint, there's a winning message there that we're going to continue to push on. It's hard because there's been several decades of concerted effort to cast doubt about the very real danger of climate chaos, but nothing like the threat of losing jobs in your community to another country, to not be part of an important transition that's going to occur anyway, to maybe wake you up. And so we're going to keep pushing with the help of our friends in the House, leaving things at our doorstep, with the new President Biden administration continuing to use that bully pulpit to not deny what's going on, but to actually help accelerate it. And, you know, I hope that between those two pressure points, even if we're in the minority in the Senate, we can continue to do some good work.
Thank you. And Matt and Rustam, quick comment each, if you could. 2021.
I'm looking forward to 2020 being over.
You're here.
I'm looking forward to trucks rolling off the line here in Portland, Oregon, electric trucks rolling off the line to make climate change a possibility.
Great. Well, thank you to each of you. They were awesome panelists, and thank you, Logan, Edward, Jake, Matt, Rustam. So honored to be a moderator for this panel, and I'm going to now turn it back over to Symbiot for, I believe, a final announcement and to close.
Yes, thank you all so much for joining us today. We have the final slides with our panelist information. A big thank you to our moderator, Jeanette, and to all of our speakers, Jake, Logan, Edward, Matt, and Rustam, for joining us today. I know we had a lot of questions we didn't get to, but we will have the opportunity with follow-ups after we send the webinar recap, which will also include the recording of the webinar as well. We look forward to you joining us next week on Tuesday, November 17th, for our next webinar, International EV Strategies and Programs. Our speakers there will highlight project strategies and their organization's work to advance transportation electrification in their country. We'll be joined by various speakers speaking on that. Before next Tuesday, we have 2 days left until the National E-Mobility Equity Virtual Conference. We hope you can all join us there starting November 12th. Again, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you or chatting with you all during the webinar recap and also on Thursday. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.